Well, let's go ahead and get started. It is just noon, and we are grateful to everyone for joining us. As Will said a little bit ago, we are in webinar mode, which means that you can see us, but we cannot see you, so have no fear. You're free to eat your lunch in peace. So thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn on Equitable Transportation Solutions. Let's go to the next slide. Our speaker today is Angela Johnson Rodriguez. Angela is the Statewide Organizing Director at Transportation for Massachusetts. She's going to tell us a little bit more about T4Mass, but you should all know it's a coalition that advocates at the state, federal, and local levels for transportation policies that are innovative and sustainable and environmentally friendly. Angela's work is with the members and other community organizations working to promote equitable access to transportation and to help ensure fairness and opportunity as technology transforms mobility. Next slide. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. MCV protects Maine's environment and our democracy by influencing public policy and holding our leaders accountable and winning elections. Next slide, and a few technical notes. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions through the chat as they occur to you. I will keep track and will ask Angela some questions at the end of the session. You can find the chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with the recordings of all our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us, and Angela, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Kathleen. Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get this started. So again, my name is Angela Johnson Rodriguez. I'm the Statewide Organizing Director at T4Mass. We're located in Boston, but we are all over the state in regards to our advocacy. And I was asked to speak with you all today about equitable investments in transportation, but really we're gonna hone in on TCI. So just to kick things off a little bit, T4Mass is a coalition of 90 members and partners across the state with a stake in equitable transportation solutions. And when we talk about transportation, we're not just focusing on, just the modes themselves. We're focusing on the people who use these modes. And that means that we often work cross-sector with folks in public health, folks in climate, folks in housing, economic development, what have you, because transportation is so much more than just, the modes that we use every single day. We also co-chair Our Transportation Future, which is a coalition of regional and local and national organizations committed to modernizing transportation across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. Our Transportation Future is really all in on the Transportation and Climate Initiative and getting that accepted by all of the governors across the states. I'm gonna go ahead and turn on this light because the sun is going in and out so you guys can see me perfectly. There we go. And finally, we also co-chair what is called the Massachusetts TCI table, or the Mass TCI table. And at that table, that is where we advocates only in Massachusetts come together to talk about what TCI means for the state of Massachusetts, for the people who live in Massachusetts. We do this in coordination with other organizations that are across the TCI states. They also belong to Our Transportation Future. What we really noticed from our advocates is that we wanted to have the conversation of what does this mean for us. And even a subset of that is the Equitable Investments Subcommittee, which is definitely where we live and where many of these investments that I'll be talking about today have been debated, agonized over by a series of partners that are across the state. So let's get into it. So what are some equitable investments in TCI that could potentially help out Massachusetts? So this is not a finger wagging activity here. I really do want you to understand that before we get into what is an equitable transportation investment, you have to define equity. And so equity is, depending on your own definition, in the Webster's Dictionary, it is considered to be fairness or justice. And a really great definition that I love, it is freedom from bias. When we do this work in transportation, we have to come in here with the understanding that we all have our own biases that have been a part of us since we were very young, and we learned them in school, or we learned them through our external environment. And no matter what, those biases will color the way that we look at transportation options, who uses them, who benefits, and who does not. And so before we even get into the investments and the solutions, because I'm a problem solver, I'm sure that just about everyone else around this table are also just problem solvers. We want to get to the heart of that issue and fix it. But sometimes it does involve taking a step back to understand why that problem exists in the first place. So I wanted to share with you all today just an excerpt from our, and by our I mean Transportation for Massachusetts, our definition of transportation justice, which is that transportation policy decisions have intentionally and unintentionally exacerbated the division and segregation of communities based on race and income. The effects of these policy decisions, such as redlining, taking land by eminent domain to build highways, and disinvestment in public and active transportation linger today and negatively impact the lives and livelihoods of people of color, low-income communities, and other marginalized populations. When we created this, this definition, which took over the course of a year, we wanted to use this as our North Star in regards to how we are going to take policy positions and how we're going to think about investments, not just in TCI, but also going forward in our own transportation system. Which is why I would love some, so I think it's just food for thought as you come with me in this journey during this webinar, as you leave today after this lunch and learn, just think about, you know, how do you define equity? How does your organization define equity? And how is that really showing, how is this really showing up in the work that you do, the people that you interact with, where you find community? So after we talk about the definition, we then have to decide, you know, where will these investments land and who will reap the benefits? When the EQIS, that's the Equitable Investment Subcommittee, when we got together as EQIS, the first few questions were, who is this for? Who will this benefit? Who stands to lose out? Because as we understand, you know, although we do not want to set up investments as a zero-sum game, transportation policy has been set up to have a set of winners and losers. And that is shown through the national highway system, that is shown through the disinvestment of public transportation in most states, not just Maine, Massachusetts, but even in my home state of Texas. So when we're talking about investments, it is for whom and to what end. And for many of us, from the enviros all the way down to the grassroots, that becomes a question of life or death. And that is why sometimes we'll see a bit of a rub, because we're all well-intentioned in what we're talking about when it comes to equitable solutions. But when you're closest to that pain, it's a bit harder of a pill to swallow. So my question that I really would love just for us to chat about when we are, you know, in that Q&A session, or just for something for you to take on after you leave this session, is how does Maine define an environmental justice community? In Massachusetts, we have several categories for environmental justice communities, which are also sometimes referred to as frontline communities. They are typically of low income and or communities of color. They typically have an income of below $25,000 or the poverty level, or they are areas where there are significant deserts, food deserts, transit deserts, economic deserts. And what you see here in this picture is actually Western Mass, which is the area that I will be primarily focusing on throughout this presentation. Although there are two big cities that anchor Western Mass, Springfield and Worcester, the majority of the towns that are surrounding it are rather far apart, and they are rural. So let's get into the investments that we have surfaced through our advocacy in TCI over the past, I think, about 2 years now. So just looking at this, this short table here, you'll see that there actually isn't that much of a difference in between what people want in an urban area, a suburban area, or a rural area. And that's on purpose, because what we are talking about when it comes to TCI and the funds that could go, the proceeds, excuse me, that could come from TCI to help our transportation system is that statewide coordination is so important. We don't want there to be just a T getting this amount of money and then rural areas getting the short end of the stick, which is the dominant perception of transportation in Massachusetts. So just to throw out a couple that we have here, electric buses. They're quite popular in urban areas, especially urban areas that are environmental justice communities, communities that are dealing with the effects of climate change, that are dealing with the effects of jet fuel runoff, et cetera. A connected and protected bike network. People want cleaner, healthier ways in order to cycle around. Personally, I'm a cycling advocate. I wasn't until I moved up to Massachusetts, but hey, things change, right? Mass Saves for Vehicles, that is a rebate program that we are studying and would love to see be applicable to low-income communities. I won't go into that so much today because I don't feel like it is as relevant just yet, but it is something that we are currently working on as policy. For suburban areas, we have first and last mile solutions. Rural areas are also about this because they want to connect to the regional transit authorities, which run the bus services outside of Greater Boston. Regional rail is important to suburban communities because of the east-west divide that exists. I don't know if it exists so much, or what does that divide look like in Maine? It'd be great to learn about that. I'm guessing it's like Portland and everyone else. But aside of taking a private bus, Peter Pan, or driving yourself, there's really no way for you to be able to bridge that gap a bit. And in the rural areas, which is actually what we're going to continue to focus on here, I'm going to really dig into microtransit and shuttles, electric vehicles, as well as broadband internet access. So electric vehicles. I don't think I really need to, fight for why electric vehicles could be a great thing. I feel like Mainers, you got it, you get it. Massachusetts is kind of the same way. When it works, it works. It does keep rural residents moving. Most of the rural residents live in communities that have no public transportation, or if it does exist, it is very sparse and therefore not reliable. So yeah, EVs are a great way to keep things moving and to reduce, if not eliminate, our dependency on oil, which will be clean, which is better for the communities, cleaner air. It's everything that we really want out of the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It's also, like I said, an effective and efficient way to travel around your community. But as we take a look at this through an equitable lens, yes, it does keep rural residents moving until they are too old to drive. So that is kind of the crux of the issue that we are thinking about right now when it comes to EVs. Yes, EVs are great up to a certain point. Massachusetts, like Maine, is an aging state. All the New England states are aging states. So what does an equitable transportation system equitable transportation solution look like when it is no longer accessible to you after the age of 70 or 75 if you're still relatively healthy and your sight is still pretty good? After the age of, I think it was 70, 1 out of 2 of us will have some sort of disability. And of course, this is not to discount the folks who already have a disability and are therefore not able to drive, period. So EVs, although they have definitely risen to the top, for many of our enviro partners, when it comes to looking at this through an equitable lens, they kind of fall towards the middle. Then we move on to, the fact that they're still relatively expensive to buy. Again, as we go back to having an age-friendly solution, it's really hard to think about owning or even having access to an electric vehicle if you live in a fixed income, or if you are a family who is living on a smaller income, living in a rural area. It may be a bit more easier to live on that income when you're in a rural area, but it's still, you still have to get the car to the nearest charging station if that charging station exists. Particularly in Massachusetts, the charging station network that we have is extremely limited. In fact, there is maybe one in my entire neighborhood of 58,000 people, and I live in one of like the hip neighborhoods of Boston, right? Where you think they would all exist. But that's also where we're seeing some pushback from rural residents who are interested in electric vehicles, but are also a little bit anxious. They're like, okay, well, how long will it actually take for you to get that EV charging station out to where I live? Will I still be around when you finally get it out here, you know? And then finally, yeah, it's efficient and effective if it exists for you. I have to say, I reached out to one of my partners, Kate McCarthy at the Vermont Natural Resources Council, because I wanted to know, you know, hey, Vermont also a rural state. What are you guys talking about over there? And she turned me onto a phrase called terrain anxiety. Maybe some of you guys have heard of it. That was the first for me. But apparently with terrain anxiety, folks who are not as keen on electric vehicles are also thinking about the fact that electric vehicles may not be able to withstand the toughness of a dirt road. And that is that's a valid point, right? But yeah, so many things that people are thinking about that sometimes us over here in Eastern Mass in our very urban bubble are just not even as aware of. But I'd love to hear some of the experiences you have in regards to that. So let's move forward onto microtransit and shuttles. So like EVs, they keep rural residents moving in a maybe a more fixed format, but they're still accessible to you if they exist in your community. They can be a flexible option that can increase or decrease according to the needs of the population. So we actually have microtransit services in and around Massachusetts, and I will share with you a really successful model in just a bit. And again, they're for all incomes, from those who make 100,000 plus for all the way down to those who have a very fixed limited income. It's still relatively easy for you to be able to jump on a microtransit shuttle, jump in a van, jump in a jitney, and go if that model exists within your community and is open to you. So when we talk about microtransit and shuttles, I actually really want to hone in on the fact that microtransit microtransit / public transportation really has a bit of there's also some anxiety there as well. Many of us are really used to that fixed format of a 40-footer bus that has 50 seats and runs on a very specific schedule. If you're in the city, it runs every 15 minutes if you're lucky. If you live in a rural area, it's running every hour, maybe hour and a half. And it just doesn't work for the needs of the population. What we would like to see with the proceeds from TCI is the proliferation of smaller, flexible van service, smaller, flexible shuttle services that can actually be tailored to the changing needs of rural populations. We have everything from, you know, older families who have always lived there, older families who've retired to live in a quieter surrounding, all the way to students who are, you know, going to school in the countryside. All of these needs need to be met in different ways. So that's why I really want to share with you a quick blurb about Quoba Valley Community Development Corporation and what's called the Quoba Connector. So QBCDC, which is what I will shorten it to, they are a longtime member of T4Mass, and they are located in Ware, Massachusetts, which is like the heartland of Western Mass. There is not much around in regards to larger economic centers such as Springfield and Worcester. So the connector has really been a lifeline for residents who live within the 9 towns that it serves. And not only does it serve the 9 towns within its immediate reach, but it also connects to 2 regional transit authorities, which are the 2 biggest of the 15. Pioneer Valley Transit Authority, which is where Springfield sits, and then the Worcester Regional Transit Authority, which is where Worcester sits, or our 2nd and 3rd largest cities in Massachusetts. So that allows people who live in these towns to still have the chance to be able to make a living outside of the towns that they prefer to reside in, because they can easily get to 2 economic centers. And the Quoba Connector has been so successful in its reach that it has received multiple pilots from our own Department of Transportation, our own DOT. It has also received many grants, some from us, some from other entities that really are trying to help rural residents be able to move about as freely and as openly as they want to, because this rural connector is not just for folks who are seniors or people with disabilities. Although it certainly is open to both of those populations, it's open to literally every resident, including dropping parents off and their children for daycare, all the way to picking up people who may have a later shift. So, and not only that, outside of Ware, Massachusetts, we are also fielding a lot of interest from partners, particularly on the North Shore. They want to talk about shuttle services. They want to get away from the 40-foot model of buses that currently exist today, because again, the needs are changing and transportation needs to be more nimble. And maybe with some proceeds from TCI, we can start to really get at the nimbleness that we are not really seeing so much. Which leads me to our, sorry about that, which leads me to the complementary policy that has really come into play for us over the past year or so, which again, biases, right? I thought that, I mean, I understood that most regions are not going to have like a super fast 1 gig internet like we do over here in Boston, but I wasn't aware of just how much of an issue it was for rural communities that were even just outside of like the towns of like Amherst or the towns of Holyoke, the town of Northampton, where there are slightly larger populations that have more than one internet provider. In particular, I was looking at Broadband Now, where they had averaged out the broadband speeds. Metro Boston, 100% access to broadband internet. Franklin County, our most rural county, very large county as well, averages out to about 80.5% has access. Now, that probably doesn't sound like much, but they are also within that Franklin County, there are also just smaller subsets where they have maybe 43% access to broadband internet. And as we now live in the age of COVID, we're all at home, we're all in front of our computers. What does that mean for someone who has to work remotely? What does that mean for someone who needs to call into a meeting like this, or has to call into a town hall because they want to see new things happening for their communities? What does that mean for a student who needs to do their work? Some students have checked out completely, and what can you do? There's nothing for them to fix. To bring this back to transportation, as we talked a lot about transportation network companies, we understand that Uber and Lyft is something we take for granted more in the urban and suburban side, because we expect it to always be there. But once you get out to the Berkshires, which is on the border of New York, you're not going to find Uber and Lyft. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is to say that where broadband internet exists, where Wi-Fi exists, where good service exists, is where transportation technology and innovation is going to follow. And if they have to put in money in order for their technology to work, they're probably not going to do it. And that is why we still see Uber and Lyft not work within these communities, which goes back to the idea of needing our own microtransit / shuttles for these rural communities, so that they are able to work outside of the confines of just good connectivity. You don't really need good connectivity in order to run a jitney service. You need to have a good sense of direction, and you don't need Wi-Fi or anything for that. We're also understanding that some rural communities would love to be able to set up some things like bike share. Valley Bike is a community bike share that is out in Western Mass. It's connected to 6 towns, if I'm not mistaken, but these are 6 of the larger towns that exist within the Pioneer Valley. They have been able to spread around to the areas that, of course, have better broadband service as well. but they are of course fielding interest from smaller towns who would like to be able to use bike share. They want to be able to bike along to Connecticut, or just be able to, you know, get from place to place out in the sun when it's quite nice here in Massachusetts, but they just can't. Right now, the bike share companies, they just aren't able to support it. So again, whenever we're talking about an equitable investment, who is it for, who will it help, and who we're potentially leaving behind. And so with these proceeds from TCI, which of course we're always continuing to think about, always continuing to refine, that is a question that we always have to keep in mind. And sometimes it you know, it kind of brings up painful feelings because you don't want to hinder someone's progress. You don't want to hinder the progress of a region as you're trying to bring about equitable transportation solutions for all. And so finally, as we go into the fall, the EQIS continues. We tend to run on a alternating schedule with the Mass TCI table, which is typically every 6 weeks. Of course, things have slowed down right now due to COVID-19. And in fact, as we continue on with the EQIS committee, we are thinking about, okay, now that COVID-19 has hit and many of our rural partners have had to shift focus, including some of our urban partners that had to shift focus, they can't even be as involved in thinking about future transportation solutions right now because they're trying to get through today. What does that mean for TCI? Right now in Massachusetts, our Governor Baker is still fully behind TCI being a done deal, including public transportation getting a good amount of a good percentage of proceeds from this investment. But we're also dealing with the fear that people have of returning to public transportation systems. We're dealing right now with employers waiving parking fees and waiving parking permits in order to kind of entice their employees to come back to work, because they know that their employees who would typically use the commuter rail to come in from the suburban locations are just not going to do it. So now the tide has turned a little bit and we're kind of fighting against that tide. You know, we were doing so great in regards to cleaning up our air and getting people away from cars and touting public transportation and biking, but COVID's kind of blown that all up, right? You can't, at this point, you can't divorce COVID-19 from anything we're thinking about in the future. And finally, we are thinking about whether we as the EQIS want to put forth a cap on investments that will go towards environmental justice communities. So when it comes to that cap, and it has not been set yet, which is why I didn't want to go so far into it, but I'm happy to go into our reasoning behind it even further during the Q&A session. But just to lay out the groundwork there, when it comes to this percentage cap on investments to environmental justice communities, we are thinking about what this percentage will be based on the experiences of Reggie. Previously, many of our advocates that are around the table now they went through the process with Reggie to change up our electric system. And the feeling that many grassroots organizations and many advocates who are living outside of wealthier urbanized areas is that homeowners got the majority share of those benefits, whereas renters did not. And there's the feeling that there are many promises that were made towards people who had lower incomes that have yet to be dealt with. And right now that divide in TCI still exists. There's definitely that distinct feeling that you're telling me beautiful, amazing words that could help my community, but historically your transportation decisions have harmed my community. And how can I not expect you to continue to harm my community again? We are hoping that by setting a specific percentage, 50% of the proceeds goes directly to environmental justice communities as defined by the EPA will actually be a way for grassroots organizations and their residents to see, okay, this money cannot be touched. This is money that could actually go towards cleaning up the air within our neighborhoods. This is money that can actually go towards advocating for the solutions that we know our residents really need and have been asking for years, if not decades. We have not landed on that percentage yet. We are still, you know what, there's still a lot of conversations that needs to be had because it gets a little iffy, like, oh, what if we say we want this 50% cap or 70% cap? Will Governor Baker still be for it? Could we potentially lose that momentum and advocacy that we've always had? Because the Mass TCI table has a good relationship with the DOT, the DEP, and the EA. We're one of the fairly lucky states that works quite well with our agencies. And we understand that by holding them to this standard could jeopardize that. But at the same time, what's more important? There's the agencies, but there's also people's livelihoods and that trust. And you know, once you break the trust, it's so hard to bring it back. And that's what we're dealing with right now in TCI advocacy. And as we continue to think about equitable solutions. So I'm gonna leave that there. And I would love to just open it up and move it on to Kathleen and ask you all, you know, what can advocates in Massachusetts learn from advocates in Maine? I would love to be able to hear your perspective as folks who live in the most rural state in the US. I've definitely learned a lot in the research that I've been doing up to today. But yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Angela. What a really fantastic presentation and great sort of level setting. You know, for a lot of these Lunch and Learn conversations that we've been hosting, we've really focused on work that's happening in Maine, but Maine is behind on TCI. So we're so grateful that we can look to our neighbors in Massachusetts and throughout the region to get a sense of how that TCI program is developing and being developed with an eye towards equity and what we can learn from your experience. So there have been some really fantastic questions, and I'm going to take a look. Maybe a good place to start would be just really briefly, what is Reggie? And then I can add on a little bit about how Maine people might find it, might recognize it.
I'm sorry, can you say the question one more time?
A question about what is Reggie?
What is Reggie? So the original greenhouse gas initiative was, and this is before my time. I was still in Texas when this happened. So I probably need a bit of help here. But the original greenhouse gas initiative was a collection of, it's a program that was very similar to TCI, except it focused on the electricity sector, the power sector, versus the transportation sector, which is what we are looking at right now. And so much of the way that we think about TCI and really the background, the foundation of TCI comes from Reggie. It was a market-based solution that was designed to lower costs overall in the power sector. And I think that, you know, it has succeeded. But of course, the conversation on equity back in 2008 was nowhere near advanced as it was today, and where it should be even going into further than today. But it was also it was a multi-state regional effort to, like I said, just reduce costs overall in the power sector.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And so for Maine people, you may recognize Reggie as the program that provides the bulk of the funding for the Efficiency Maine Trust. So if you have gotten a rebate when you upgraded to a more energy efficient washing machine, or if you put in a heat pump or insulated your attic, you have been a direct beneficiary of some Reggie revenue directed towards Maine. And of course, we've all seen our electricity get cleaner over time because of that program. Thank you. Let's see what else. Oh, You know what? I'm gonna flip back actually, because I got so excited to get into the questions that I skipped the call to action. So
Oh, okay.
let's go to that, and then we'll come back to questions.
Sure.
So we have two calls to action today, and the first is really directly linked to this presentation, and we'd love for you to reach out to the Maine Climate Council and urge them to support equitable transportation solutions through TCI. There's a link to that to that portal in the chat right now, and we'll include it in the email that goes out this afternoon. The second might seem a little bit more removed until you remember that elections always have consequences for all of our priorities. Maine has a primary election coming up on July 14th, and MCV and our partners are asking folks to pledge to vote absentee. And that will make sure that in-person voting is available and safe for those who need it. And there's a link to that in the chat as well, and we'll go out in the email so you can request an absentee ballot. I'm also seeing a note in the chat that in terms of, Angela, your great conversation about broadband, Maine actually has a bond on the ballot on July 14th to support broadband infrastructure. So another good reason to make sure you vote in July. Thank you. Okay, let's go back to some other questions that are coming in. You mentioned terrain anxiety, which I had not heard that phrase either. I've heard a lot about range anxiety, and I've heard this sort of general sense like, will EVs really work in Maine? And I wondered if you could share anything you might know about expanded EV offerings. Are we talking a Prius for the rest of time, or are there some other models that might help us alleviate that terrain anxiety?
Yeah, so in Massachusetts, we are seeing, the range from hybrids. In fact, I know many advocates, especially in the environmental sector, who drive hybrids all the way down to zero emission vehicles. So they run the range in regards to the fuel efficiency all the way to no fuel at all, income, and of course in income levels. The anxiety, of course, just always come back to range anxiety. Just how far can I actually go? Hybrids can go fairly far. I think my friend gets 200 miles for his. I don't drive, so I think that sounds good. But also just where are the current charging stations located, and how quickly can they be deployed, and is it actually a good solution for some communities versus others? Unfortunately, in Massachusetts, EVs have the perception of being for those who are wealthier and white, and who may live in, if they live in towns, they tend to live in like very small towns that are still quite wealthy and may or may not be attached to an academic institution. So that's much of the Amherst area, Amherst, Northampton area, versus in low-income neighborhoods, as well as communities of color, where you are hard-pressed, truly hard-pressed to find a charging station. So EVs can have a very hard sell depending on who you're speaking to. But to go back to the different types of EVs that are out there, it really runs the gamut in regards to what showings we've seen, what conferences we've gone to. And I mean, they look amazing. And they are really working on their range, because these companies are aware of the range anxiety that's there. But again, no one has talked about terrain anxiety. That one was new for me.
One of the things that reminded me of is that in the Climate Council meetings that happened last week, the Transportation Working Group started off by saying the whole EV transition really is being driven by auto manufacturers, and that they are seeing this as the future. So you're absolutely right that, you know, the cars that we drive in rural areas may not match their prospective surveys exactly, but it is coming from the manufacturers. We have a couple of questions about the rural shuttle services that you described. Let's see, so maybe I'll ask them all and then you can sort of tick through them. Question about funding, whether those are public-private partnerships or government funding, and then a question about the scheduling. Are they on a fixed route? Are they on demand? How does that tend to work?
Okay. So in regards to the funding, I know with Quoba, they receive actually kind of all three. They get some private funding, they get a good amount of government funding because they also are contracted through Councils on Aging, as well as the DOT. And then they do receive some public funding, such as from foundation, well, that's private as well, excuse me, private foundation money and some donations and also funding from coalitions like mine. They run on a very small staff. I think it's a staff of 3 that helps to deal with the scheduling. The scheduling is actually a good mix of fixed routes. So I know in a couple of the routes, they run from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. But the ones that are contracted to work with the Councils on Aging are on demand. So they're as you called in and they're as you need it. They do work a bit better, excuse me, in that versus say the ride being the paratransit service of the MBTA, where you still have to call 24 hours in advance, which, you know, that's not an equitable solution. Someone in a wheelchair should be able to just get up and go wherever they want to in the same way that I as an able-bodied person is able to. And so their demand service through the Council on Aging does help to shorten that gap of time quite a bit. So it's a good mix of both that they've been able to employ. Other microtransit services are also on that fixed schedule of that like 7 to 6, 6 to 6 schedule, but that's also due to capacity constraints. But as I said before, many of these rural areas are calling on for a more flexible service, and yeah, they will need the funding in order to do that.
Yeah, it sounds like flexibility really is the key there. But maybe there's a question that might have a slightly different answer too. How can we make microtransit more appealing to folks who have been driving their own cars for forever and see that as part of their way of life?
Yeah, that's always a tough one, right? And I mean, I understand our perspective. I grew up in the suburbs of Houston. There wasn't public transportation, and Lord knows they were against it. So what I have really been doing my best to not do is scare people into really understanding that, like I said earlier, there will come a point in time where you have to give up those keys. That's one aspect. My grandma, she made the decision to let go of her keys at the age of 80. She's 87. She's still very sprightly. She kind of hates it, but she also understands that she can't drive that much anymore. But at the same time, because of where we live in the suburbs, she has to call 2 days in advance in order to go to the doctor's office. And she can't always remember to do that. So that leaves her to be stuck at home. We tend to focus on transportation solutions that impact us right here and now, as we're younger people who can just get up and move whenever we want to. We don't actually plan for a future that includes the day that we won't be able to. And we certainly don't plan for solutions that are going to help people that are children now who can't drive, as well as people that are older now who also can't drive. And we don't include people who can't drive at all, who've never been able to drive for various reasons. Our entire system has basically narrowed down into just one singular focus, and that is driving a car. The car is a great efficient mode, but it shouldn't be the only mode that we have. I understand that there is still stigma about public transportation and grew up with it. Some of it is classes, some of it is races, and many of it is at the intersection of the two. But by having But by having options, that's what we really need to focus on. Having microtransit, in addition to your car that's in your driveway, provides you with an option. Because what happens when that car breaks down tomorrow? How are you going to get to work? What happens if that car breaks down and your child misses the bus? How are you going to get them to school? If there was an on-demand shuttle service that could take both of you to work and your child to school, that saves you time, it saves you money, and it completely erases that anxiety of being stuck. That is how we talk about it.
It's so great. And, you know, school buses are a perfect example, right, of public transit that we all grow up with and are just so visible in our communities, and we don't have that same kind of stigma about. So that's really interesting.
We don't think about the school bus except for just school, but it's like, it could be so much more. Thank you, Vermont, for teaching me that it could be so much more.
There's a question here about how commuter rail may fit into this. So we're talking about on-road transit, but what does rail look like in Western Mass in particular? Because I think that's probably most comparable to Maine.
Oh yeah. Rail is that dividing point. It really is when it comes to transportation in Massachusetts. That east-west divide is because there isn't a rail system that connects the two, and there hasn't been for decades. Every couple of years or so, we have the debate about east-west rail, which would connect Boston to Springfield, the westernmost large metroplex in Massachusetts. Where it tends to fall apart for many people is funding and ridership. But to people who live in Springfield, it's that connection that brings them back to the rest of Massachusetts. But it still hasn't really received enough support, both from the public and from legislators, in order to make it happen. It's the same with the north-south divide, Boston to the South Coast, where New Bedford used to be the heart of the whaling industry. They are still kind of on their own. And again, funds, actually, this was like the pet project of my former boss, Christina Egan. It comes down to funds and potential ridership. But if you really speak to a lot of advocates who particularly living in the rural areas, they are like, the train needs to come back. We can't just rely on public buses and people driving in. Like, the train needs to come back. This is a economic development opportunity that is being wasted. And then in regards to the commuter rail system, which snakes out a bit, it goes about as far as Worcester, the middle, which is about smack dab in the middle, central Mass, and it goes up to almost the New Hampshire border and to about as far south as like not quite New Bedford. That takes about another hour or so. The commuter rail does exist, and microtransit shuttles like the Quoba Connector actually do connect to the commuter rail there. So it connects to commuter rail that's in the Worcester Regional Transit Authority catchment area, and it connects to private buses and Amtrak that exist within Springfield. So people who use that connector, live in those 9 towns that it serves, are also able to jump on that service. But definitely, people who live within the regional transit authorities in the rural areas, they want to be able to connect to the commuter rail, because that's a job opportunity that they may not have otherwise.
Really interesting. Thank you. You mentioned funding, and that connects to another question we have here. How can you persuade folks to support the need? So this says support a tax increase. Isn't that how TCI is funded? So maybe talk a little bit more about, where does the money come from?
The money will.
Oh, I muted you instead of me. I'm so sorry. And now I'm not. Oh, Will, can you fix that?
I think we're good. Okay, great. So yeah, the cap does come from a cap on, the cap is due to emissions on large scale refineries, oil companies oil companies that are up and down the Northeast. And it is fair to say that these companies will pass some of the cost on to us. And it's also fair to say that we have an institutionalized hatred of taxes. I get that. However, and we deal with this a lot, because we know that TCI is a bit more of an easier sell than the gas tax, which typically tends to raise a lot of hackles. With TCI, it's a bit easier for folks in Massachusetts to swallow because it's not a direct tax onto you right now, although you do understand later that you may pay a bit more at the pump. It is a bit more palatable to go for Massachusetts residents to see the government basically going after these polluting companies versus going after everyday residents. Now, where it does get a little bit tricky in regards to equity is how much of a burden will a couple of cents be to someone who, again, makes $100,000 versus someone whose family living on an income of $30,000. And that is where we have some of the complementary policies that are supposed to help mitigate those strategies, help mitigate that strategy. In particular, we were thinking of a complementary policy to help level the playing field a bit with the earned income tax credit. Another complementary policy we're thinking about is investing funds in broadband internet. Another one we're thinking about includes, actually, let me say those two: earned income tax credit and then broadband internet. We were trying to do our best in regards to speaking with grassroots organizations and grassroots advocates who are more price sensitive, but do understand the need for a mechanized system that will help to clean up our air and will actually punish oil companies, these big companies, for polluting our air, especially because it really hits these environmental justice communities and their grassroots advocates so much harder than it does anyone else. So it's both when we talk about the potential tax increase and the potential increase on gasoline, it's definitely that moral thing. And it's also that, oil companies are having to understand that they can't pollute in the same way that they used to. It's also understanding that some of these companies may have to eventually close business. And another is some of these companies may understand that cleaner energy sources such as wind, such as solar, may actually be the better way to go, and could also start to catch on even more so with the residents who are living in Massachusetts. So while that wasn't the most direct way to answer your question, because we're still struggling with it right now, and I think we're going to continue to struggle with it until the MOU is signed and it starts happening, those are just some of the strategies that we are trying to take in order to make this even more palatable for voters in Massachusetts.
Yeah. Well, and it's really interesting and so helpful to think about that, and to think about how Reggie has played out, because each of the states really does have this ability to use the revenue the way they decide.
Exactly.
So so our neighbors in New Hampshire have refunded a lot of that Reggie revenue directly to consumers.
Mm-hmm.
In Maine, we've used it to fund Efficiency Maine and support these programs that help us reduce our energy needs. So it's like that sort of cumulative impact of really using that revenue to keep making us more and more efficient. So it's that choice of, can we, yes, it takes some funding, but what that funding allows us to accomplish is pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, we've got a few more. Is there also the possibility that we could use some of that TCI funding to subsidize EVs to make them more accessible to folks at different points on the income scale?
Yeah, so that's sort of the underlying foundation of what Mass Saves for Vehicles is supposed to be. we want to be able to structure this using the TCI proceeds. We want to be able to structure the rebates in a way that you receive more if you are you're below a certain income per the number of folks in your household, and then of course you lessen it a bit as you go further up the scale. But that's exactly the whole mechanism of having massive vehicles, a sliding scale of rebates that will enable more people to be able to afford electric vehicles while using the proceeds from TCI to fund it.
Fabulous, fabulous. And folks should know that Efficiency Maine does have EV rebates in place now, and that one of the sort of controls that we have in Maine on that is that there's a limit to the value of the vehicle. So if you're buying a really high-end pricey EV, you probably don't need the rebate. So you're not going to get it. Angela, thank you so much. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and for digging into these really important and tough conversations about equity and income inequality and how the policies that we're thinking about with a climate lens can also help advance social and racial justice and economic and environmental justice and justice overall. We will send out a brief survey later this afternoon, and we're really welcome your feedback. So please take a few minutes to fill that out. If you have enjoyed this Lunch and Learn, I encourage you to join us. We're here every Friday from 12 to 1, except we won't be here next Friday. So please join us on July 10th at noon. Our guest on the 10th will be Professor Darren Ranko. Professor Ranko is an associate professor of anthropology and the coordinator of Native American research at the University of Maine. He's also a citizen of the Penobscot Indian Nation and will be...
Oh no, did you freeze?
I think she froze.
Oh no.
Oh no. Well,
about climate change, environmental justice, joining us. Thank you, Angela, for oh, did I freeze?
Oh, you froze.
Oh, well, now it's telling me my internet connection is unstable.
You gotta work on it.
Broadband,
so
support the broadband.
On July 14th.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.
Y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.